For years, corrupt cops and ruthless bikers ruled Crestwood like tyrants, their alliance a chokehold on the town's soul, until they torched the wrong man's home. Isaiah Carter, a black Delta Force hero who'd survived wars most couldn't fathom, watched his sanctuary burn to ash at their hands, the flames swallowing a life he'd built from the ground up. They thought they'd crushed him, silenced him, left him with nothing but embers and despair. They didn't know he was a weapon forged in shadows, a man who'd turn their fire into their funeral pyre. Now a storm of vengeance is rising from the ashes, and they'll pay with everything they've stolen, starting with their empire, ending with their freedom. The night was quiet in Crestwood, a small town nestled on the edge of the American Midwest, until the roar of engines shattered the stillness. It was March 15, 2025, and Isaiah Carter stood on the porch of his modest two-story home, a beer in hand, the cool spring air brushing against his skin. At 39, Isaiah was a man forged in fire, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, a former Delta Force operative who'd traded covert missions for the simplicity of a mechanic's life. His dark skin bore scars from battles fought in shadows, but his face carried a calm that belied the storm within. This house, built with his own hands over years of sweat and solitude, was his sanctuary, a place where the past stayed buried, where the echoes of war faded into the hum of a quiet life. The rumble grew louder, headlights slicing through the dark as a pack of bikers rolled up his dirt driveway, their Harleys glinting under the porch light like predators' eyes. Leather vests flashed the skull and snake emblem of the Iron Reapers, a gang known in Crestwood for their brutality and their stranglehold on the town's underbelly. Isaiah set his beer down on the weathered railing, his instincts kicking in, his hand brushing the concealed tactical knife at his belt, a habit from years of never being truly unarmed. Behind the bikers, a police cruiser pulled in, its red and blue lights flashing lazily, a mockery of law in a town where justice bent to the will of men like these. Two white cops stepped out, Officer Travis Kane and Officer Ryan Decker, their smirks visible even in the dim glow, their uniforms crisp but their eyes cold. "Evening, Carter," Kane drawled, his voice thick with mockery as he leaned against the cruiser, his broad frame casting a shadow across the gravel. His buzz-cut hair gleamed faintly under the porch light, his hand resting casually near his holstered gun. "Heard you've been stirring up trouble." Isaiah's eyes narrowed, his posture steady, his voice low and firm as he stepped to the edge of the porch, his boots creaking on the wood. "Trouble? I fix cars for a living. You're the ones rolling up my driveway at midnight with a pack of—" Decker chuckled, stepping closer, his leaner build moving with a twitchy energy, his hand resting on his baton as he tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Fix cars? Funny how folks around here say you've been asking questions, poking your nose where it don't belong, talking to the wrong people about the wrong things." Isaiah tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Decker's, his tone flat but edged with steel. "I mind my business. Maybe you should try it sometime. Keep your little games off my land." Kane's smirk widened but his eyes turned cold, a glint of menace flickering beneath the surface as he straightened, his hand dropping to his gun with deliberate slowness. "See, that's the problem with guys like you, Carter. Always think you're smarter than you are, think you can say no and walk away. We've got a little operation running, some goods moving through town, and we don't need you messing it up." Isaiah's jaw tightened, his fingers brushing the knife again, though he kept his hands still, his voice dropping lower, a quiet warning rumbling beneath his calm. "Goods? You mean the drugs I've seen your biker friends hauling through my shop's back lot? I told you last week at the garage I'm not playing your game, Kane. Take your filth somewhere else." Decker's laugh was sharp, cutting through the night like a jagged blade, his baton tapping against his palm as he stepped onto the porch stairs, his eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and threat. "Game? This ain't a game, boy. This is how Crestwood works. You either play along or you're out of the picture. And trust me, we've got ways of making that real clear." Isaiah's grip tightened on the railing, the word boy hitting him like a slap, but he'd heard it too many times in his life to flinch. Too many times in barracks and bars, in towns like this where men like Kane and Decker thought it gave them power. He stepped forward, his broad frame filling the porch doorway, his voice steady, unyielding. "I'm not your boy. Get off my land." Kane straightened fully, his hand closing around his gun, drawing it with a slow, deliberate motion that made the bikers shift behind him, their boots crunching gravel as they fanned out. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low, menacing, his smirk fading into something harder. "We're not asking, Carter. You're either in or you're gone. The bikers moved, 5 of them stepping forward, their faces shadowed under their helmets, their hands gripping weapons, chains, crowbars, and one a hulking figure with a scarred face, pulling a Molotov cocktail from his vest. The glass glinted as he lit the rag, the flame flaring orange in the dark, a silent promise of destruction. Isaiah's hand moved to his knife, his body tensing, ready to draw, but Cain raised his gun, aiming it square at Isaiah's chest, the barrel steady, his eyes cold. "Move and you're dead," Cain snapped, his voice a whip crack cutting through the night, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Torch it, boys. Let's see how tough he is without his little shack." The scarred biker hurled the Molotov, the bottle arcing through the air, shattering against the porch with a roar as flames erupted, licking up the wooden walls with a hunger that devoured the dry timber. Isaiah lunged forward, his knife flashing as he aimed for Cain, but Decker was faster. His baton cracked against Isaiah's ribs with a dull thud, sending him sprawling to the gravel, the air knocked from his lungs in a sharp gasp. The bikers laughed, their rough voices rising over the crackling fire, tossing more bottles, one through a window, another against the roof, flames spreading fast, the heat searing Isaiah's skin as he hit the ground, his vision blurring with pain and rage. He scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged, his dark eyes locked on the blaze, as it consumed his home, the walls he'd hammered, the roof he'd shingled, the memories etched into every board. "You bastards," he growled, his voice shaking with a fury that burned hotter than the fire, his fists clenching as he took a step toward Cain, the knife still in his hand. Cain holstered his gun, stepping closer, his smirk returning as he loomed over Isaiah, the firelight casting his shadow long and twisted across the gravel. "Should have played ball, Carter," he said, his tone dripping with mockery, his eyes glinting with triumph. "Now you've got nothing. Nothing but ash and a lesson you won't forget." Decker twirled his baton, stepping beside Cain, his smirk widening as he watched the flames climb higher, the roof buckling with a groan that shook the night. "Tough guy, huh? Not so tough now, are you?" he taunted, his voice high, gleeful, a coward reveling in borrowed power. Isaiah's fists clenched tighter, his blood boiling, his chest heaving as he stared at the inferno, years of his life swallowed by fire, reduced to smoke and ruin at the hands of these men. He didn't strike, not yet. He'd been trained for this, for worse in places where losing control meant death. Cain and Decker thought they'd won, thought they'd broken him with their fire and their sneers, thought their badges and their biker muscle made them invincible. They were wrong, dead wrong. As the bikers roared off into the night, their engines fading into the distance and the cruiser peeled away, its lights cutting through the smoke, Isaiah stood amid the wreckage, the fire reflecting in his dark eyes, turning them into twin embers of rage. His home was gone, his sanctuary lost, but something else rose from the ashes, a vow, a promise, a storm brewing in his soul. "You'll pay," he whispered, his voice low, steady, a pledge to the flames that devoured his past, "every last one of you." The dawn broke gray and heavy over Crestwood, smoke still curling from the blackened skeleton of Isaiah Carter's home, as the first light filtered through the haze. He stood in the ruins, his boots crunching charred wood and shattered glass, his hands streaked with soot as he surveyed the wreckage. The air stank of gasoline and loss, the once sturdy house now a pile of ash and twisted metal, walls collapsed into heaps, the roof a jagged frame against the sky. The porch where he'd stood last night, reduced to a smoldering outline. Everything he'd built, every nail driven, every memory carved into the wood was gone, swallowed by the fire Cain, Decker, and the iron reapers had set. His truck, parked a safe distance down the driveway, was all that remained, a lifeline in the debris, its faded paint glinting faintly in the morning light. Isaiah's ribs ached from Decker's baton, a sharp sting flaring with every breath. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the fire in his chest, a rage that burned hotter than the blaze that had taken his home. He'd faced death in war zones, IEDs exploding under Humvees, snipers pinning him in crumbling villages, ambushes in jungles where the air itself was an enemy. But this was different, personal, a wound that cut deeper than shrapnel. Cain and Decker hadn't just burned his house, they'd burned his peace, his refuge, the life he'd clawed out of the chaos of his past. And for what? To punish him for saying no, to silence him because he wouldn't bend to their filthy drug racket. He'd told them last week at his garage. Kane leaning against a workbench, Decker smirking by the door, offering cash to store their shipments through his shop. He'd smelled the rot then, cops and bikers running meth through Crestwood, a town too small, too broken to fight back. Now, they'd made it a war. He knelt in the ashes, sifting through the debris with steady hands, his fingers brushing a melted photo frame. Him and his younger sister Lena, smiling at her wedding 5 years ago, her white dress stark against his dress blues. The glass was cracked, the photo curled and charred, a memory reduced to ruin. His jaw tightened, his breath steadying as the Delta Force training kicked in, a cold clarity cutting through the grief. Rage was fuel, but it needed direction, purpose, a plan to turn their fire back on them. He stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, his dark eyes scanning the wreckage one last time. Kane and Decker thought they'd won because they had badges, because the Reapers had numbers, because Crestwood bent to their will. They didn't know who they'd unleashed, a man who'd survived hell, who'd taken down warlords with less than they had, who'd turned their own weapons against them. A car rolled up the driveway, gravel crunching under tires, breaking the silence. Isaiah turned, his hand instinctively brushing the knife at his belt, his body tensing for a fight, but he relaxed when he saw the driver. Lena Carter, his sister, stepping out of her beat-up sedan, her sharp features hardening as she took in the destruction. At 34, Lena was a private investigator, with a fire of her own, her dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail, her leather jacket slung over her shoulder, her eyes blazing with a fury that matched his own. She crossed the yard in long strides, her boots kicking up ash, her voice tight with anger, as she stopped beside him. "Isaiah," she said, her tone clipped, her gaze sweeping the ruins before locking onto his face, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "What the hell happened? I heard the fire trucks last night, thought it was some damn accident until I saw this." He met her gaze, his voice low, steady, a storm held in check as he stepped over a charred beam, his boots crunching glass. "Kane and Decker, Iron Reapers, they wanted me in on their drug racket, offered me cash to store their shipments at the garage. I said no last week, told them to keep their filth away from me. This is their answer. Burned it all to the ground last night." Stood there laughing while it went up. Lena's fists clenched tighter, her eyes flashing with a rage that mirrored his own, her voice a blade cutting through the morning air. "Those bastards. I told you they were dirty. Been digging into them for months, Isaiah." Kane's got a rap sheet a mile long buried under red tape, and Decker's his little shadow, covering tracks. They're working with the Reapers, moving meth through Crestwood, shaking down anyone who doesn't play along. "Digging." Isaiah raised an eyebrow, stepping closer, his tone sharp with interest as he crossed his arms, soot smearing his sleeves. "What have you got, Lena? Give me something I can use." She pulled a folder from her bag, its edges worn, stuffed with papers that spilled slightly as she handed it over, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Complaints, assault, extortion, missing evidence, all buried by the precinct. Witnesses who disappeared, reports rewritten. They're running a pipeline with the Reapers, meth coming in from a cartel south of town, distributed through back roads. No one's touched them because Holt covers their asses, but I've got names, dates, places. It's not enough to nail them yet, not legally, but it's a start." Isaiah flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the details with the precision of a soldier reading a battle map. Kane 12 years on the force, excessive force complaints dismissed. Decker 8 years, linked to missing evidence and witness intimidation. Iron Reapers, meth labs, shakedowns, arson tied to their name, all swept under the rug. He paused on a grainy photo, Kane and a scarred Reaper, shaking hands outside a bar, cash changing hands. His jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the folder as the pieces clicked into place. "They think they're untouchable," he said, his voice low, a vow forming in the words. "They think they can burn me out and walk away. They won't be," Lena said, stepping closer, her voice a blade of its own, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce determination. "You're not doing this alone, Isaiah. They burned our home. Mom's old recipes in that kitchen. Dad's tools in the garage. Everything we had left. I'm in on this, whether you like it or not. He shook his head, his tone firm but softened by the bond between them, his hand resting on her shoulder for a moment. This is my fight, Lena. I don't want you caught in the crossfire. Not with men like these. It's ours, she snapped, shrugging off his hand, her voice rising with a fire that matched the ashes around them. They didn't just burn your house. They burned our family, our history. I'm not sitting this out. I've got contacts, skills, ways to hit them where it hurts. You're not the only one who knows how to fight, big brother. Isaiah exhaled, studying her for a long moment, her clenched fists, her blazing eyes, the resolve etched into her sharp features. He nodded once, a reluctant acceptance, his voice low. Fine, get me more. Locations, routines, anything you've got on that cartel hookup. I'll handle the rest. My way. Lena smirked faintly, a spark of triumph in her eyes, as she tucked the folder back into her bag, her tone softening but still firm. You're not the only one who's stubborn. I'll have it by tonight. Watch your back, Isaiah. He didn't argue, watching as she climbed into her car and drove off, the gravel crunching under her tires as she disappeared down the road. He turned back to the ashes, his vow hardening into a plan, as the wind stirred the debris around him. A storm brewing, a reckoning rising from the ruins. Kane, Decker, the Reapers, they'd lit the match, thinking they'd silenced him, thinking they'd won. They didn't know Isaiah Carter didn't break. He burned brighter, hotter, until his enemies were ash. He'd start tonight, and he wouldn't stop until they paid, every last one of them. The day dragged slow and heavy over Crestwood, the sun climbing reluctantly into a sky, still thick with the haze of last night's fire. Isaiah Carter didn't linger in the ashes of his home. Grief was a luxury he couldn't afford, not now. By noon, he'd salvaged what he could from the wreckage. A duffel bag of gear, stashed in his truck's toolbox, untouched by the flames, night vision goggles, a tactical knife with a serrated edge, a burner phone with no trace, and a Glock 19 he'd kept from his Delta Force days, its suppressor still snug in its case. These were the tools of a hunter, buried for years under the guise of a mechanic's life, now unearthed by necessity. He drove to a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind where cash bought silence, and the clerk didn't ask questions, checking in under a false name. James Reed, his truck parked out of sight behind a dumpster. The room was cramped, its air stale with cigarette smoke and mildew, the bed sagging under a threadbare blanket, but it was a base, a place to plan, to strike, to turn his rage into a weapon. Isaiah dumped the duffel on the bed, unzipping it with steady hands, the gear spilling out like relics of a past he'd tried to leave behind. He pulled Lena's folder from his jacket, its worn edges curling as he spread the papers across the mattress, a battlefield map of Crestwood's corruption. Kane and Decker were the linchpins. 12 years on the force for Kane, a history of excessive force complaints buried by Captain Holt. 8 years for Decker, a shadow who covered tracks, linked to missing evidence, and witness intimidation. The Iron Reapers were their muscle, a biker gang with a meth pipeline snaking through Crestwood's back roads, their hangouts scrawled in Lena's tight handwriting. A bar called the Rusty Nail on Main Street, a warehouse off Route 17, a chop shop near the river where they stashed their hauls. Isaiah traced the locations with his finger, his mind already plotting. Strike points, weak links, places where shadows could hide a hunter. He began with recon, slipping into dark clothes, a black hoodie, worn jeans, boots scuffed from years of hard use, his knife sheathed at his belt, his Glock tucked into his waistband, the burner phone in his pocket. At dusk, he drove to the Rusty Nail, a biker dive pulsing with neon and noise, its gravel lot packed with Harleys gleaming under the flickering sign. He parked across the street behind a shuttered storefront, blending into the evening traffic, his sharp eyes scanning the scene through a pair of binoculars he'd pulled from the duffel. The bar was alive, Reapers spilling out the door, their leather vests glinting, their laughter rough and loud as they swigged beers and smoked cigarettes, the air thick with the tang of exhaust and stale hops. At 9 p.m., Kane's cruiser pulled up, its red and blue lights off, the cop stepping out with a swagger that didn't match the bruises still darkening his jaw from last night's fire. Decker followed, his lean frame twitchy, his eyes darting as he adjusted his holster, his swollen lip, a faint reminder of the baton he'd wielded. They met a biker outside, a hulking figure with a scarred face, the same one who'd lit the first Molotov, his leather vest patched with the Reaper's emblem, his handshake quick but loaded, as he passed Kane a small bag, cash exchanging hands in a blur. Isaiah snapped photos with his binoculars built-in camera, the lens catching every detail, the bag, the money, Kane's smirk as he pocketed it, Decker's nervous glance over his shoulder. Sloppy, Isaiah muttered, zooming in, his voice a low rumble in the truck's cab. Too damn comfortable. The chop shop was next. At midnight he crept through the shadows along the river, the water's sluggish flow masking his steps as he approached the rusted warehouse near the bank. He planted a micro camera on a fence post, its lens hidden among the peeling paint, streaming live to his burner phone. Bikers unloading crates from a van, Kane overseeing with a cigarette dangling from his lips, Decker counting cash by the flickering light of a lantern. Meth, guns, maybe both. The crates were heavy, the bikers' movements quick but careless, their voices carrying over the water. Move it, damn it, Kane barked, his tone sharp, his bruised face tight with tension. Carter's out there. I can feel it. Isaiah's lips twitched into a faint smile, a predator's grin. They were rattled already, and he'd barely begun. Back at the motel, he synced the footage to his laptop, the glow illuminating his scarred face as he watched the chop shop scene unfold. Bikers hauling crates, Kane pacing, Decker's nervous fidgeting. He cross-referenced it with Lena's files, names of victims surfacing, their stories a grim litany. A bar owner beaten for refusing to pay protection, a mechanic, maybe like him, whose shop was torched for saying no, a kid arrested on fake charges to keep him quiet. The pattern was clear. Kane and Decker ran Crestwood like a fiefdom, the Reapers their enforcers, their corruption, a cancer feeding off the town's fear. Isaiah's house wasn't the first they'd burned, but it'd be the last. He leaned back on the sagging bed, his eyes drifting to the Glock on the table, its suppressor gleaming faintly in the dim light, a silent promise of what was to come. You wanted a fight, he muttered, his voice a low rumble in the empty room, his hands steady as he cleaned the knife, its edge catching the light. You've got one. The hunter had awakened, and Crestwood's shadows were his hunting ground. The night stretched long and black over Crestwood, the air thick with the promise of frost as Isaiah Carter moved at 2 a.m., the hour when the town slept and its predators grew careless. His target was the chop shop near the river, a hub for the Iron Reaper's dirty work, a rusted warehouse where they stashed their meth and guns, guarded by 3 bikers and a loose perimeter of chain-link fence. He'd scouted it last night, the micro-camera confirming their routine, 2 outside smoking and joking, 1 inside counting crates, all of them lazy, drunk by now, their arrogance leaving them vulnerable. Isaiah meant to hit them hard, draw first blood and send a message that would echo through Crestwood's underbelly. He slipped from his truck, parked a quarter-mile out in a shadowed copse of pines, his dark hoodie pulled low, his boots silent on the damp grass as he moved through the woods toward the riverbank. His duffel bag hung over his shoulder, packed light but lethal, his tactical knife, a collapsible baton, a roll of duct tape and the Glock with its suppressor, a last resort if things went loud. The air was cool, the river's sluggish flow masking his approach, its surface glinting faintly under the crescent moon. He moved like a ghost, his Delta Force training snapping into place, silent steps, steady breaths, senses sharp as he scanned the shadows for movement. The chop shop came into view through the trees, its rusted walls looming against the night sky, the faint glow of a lantern spilling from a broken window. 2 Reapers stood outside the fence, their leather vests glinting under the dim floodlight, their voices rough with laughter as they passed a bottle of whiskey back and forth. Carter's probably crying in the ashes, one grunted, a tall figure with a shaved head, his crowbar resting against the fence. Tough guy didn't know what hit him, The other, a wiry man with a patchy beard, chuckled, taking a swig, his chain dangling from his belt. Inside, the third biker's shadow moved past the window, counting crates with a flashlight, his curses faint over the river's hum. Isaiah struck the first guard at the gate, a quick slash of his knife across the man's throat, a silent kill that dropped him in a heap, blood pooling dark against the gravel, his gurgling gasp swallowed by the night. The second turned, his whiskey bottle slipping from his hand as he fumbled for his chain, his eyes widening in the dark. "What the?" he started, but Isaiah was on him, sidestepping the clumsy swing, driving his baton into the man's skull with a dull thud that echoed softly over the water. The biker crumpled, unconscious before he hit the ground, his chain clattering beside him, and Isaiah dragged both bodies into the shadows, binding their wrists with duct tape to keep them down. Inside, the warehouse was a cluttered mess, crates stacked high, tools scattered across the concrete floor, the air thick with the chemical tang of meth. The third biker sprawled in a chair near the back, a bottle in one hand, a flashlight in the other, his rough voice muttering as he heaved. 26, 27, damn Kane, always shorting us. He didn't hear Isaiah until it was too late, the knife pressed against his neck, its edge cold and sharp, drawing a thin bead of blood as Isaiah's voice rumbled low in his ear. "Where's your boss?" Isaiah growled, his tone lethal, his grip steady as he pinned the biker's arm to the chair, the flashlight clattering to the floor. The biker's eyes widened, his breath hitching, his bottle slipping from his hand to shatter on the concrete, spilling whiskey in a dark puddle. Who the hell are you?" he stammered, his voice rough with panic, his body trembling under Isaiah's unyielding hold. "Wrong answer," Isaiah said, tightening the blade, the blood trickling faster down the man's neck, staining his vest. "Scarface, the one who lit my house." "Where?" The biker's eyes darted, fear breaking through his bravado, his voice cracking as he spoke. "Warehouse, Route 17, tomorrow night. He's meeting Kane there. Please, man, don't." Isaiah knocked him out with a sharp blow to the temple, the man's head lolling as he slumped in the chair, blood and whiskey mixing on the floor. He bound the biker's wrists with duct tape, dragging him to a corner, then planted another microcamera near the crates, its lens catching the scene, streaming live to his burner phone. He grabbed a crate of meth as evidence, its weight heavy in his hands, proof of the Reaper's trade to add to his growing archive. Back at the motel, he synced the footage, bikers scrambling as their guards went down, panic setting in, their rough voices shouting into the night. He watched it loop on his laptop, a faint smile tugging at his lips, a predator's satisfaction settling over him. The chop shop was a message, he could hit them anywhere, anytime, silent and unstoppable. The Reapers would talk, their fear spreading, and Kane and Decker would hear that the ghost in the shadows wasn't a myth, but a man with a knife and a vow. Isaiah cleaned his blade, the blood rinsing off in thin streams down the sink, his hands steady as he "First blood," he muttered, his voice a low rumble in the empty room. "More to come." The morning sun climbed into a gray Crestwood sky, casting a pallid light over the precinct, as whispers of the chop shop hit spread through the town like a virus. It was 6 days since Isaiah Carter's house burned, and the Reapers were reeling. 3 men down, a crate missing, no trace of the attacker beyond the blood and silence he'd left behind. Isaiah watched from his truck, parked a block away behind a shuttered gas station, his telephoto lens trained on the precinct's entrance, his dark hoodie pulled low, his sharp eyes catching every flicker of movement. The air was thick with tension, the town waking to a shift it couldn't name, a crack in the foundation of Kane and Decker's empire. At 8 a.m., Kane stormed into the precinct, his face a mess of bruises, jaw swollen from the night his house burned, his left arm cradled stiffly, his uniform wrinkled and stained with soot from the chaos he'd fled. Decker followed, limping slightly, his eyes darting with paranoia, his swollen lip a faint reminder of the baton he'd wielded against Isaiah, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. The swagger they'd carried was gone, replaced by a brittle tension that radiated from every jerky movement, every furtive glance toward the growing crowd outside. Protesters trickling in, their signs reading, "Justice now," their voices a low hum of anger stirring the morning air. Isaiah smirked faintly, a cold satisfaction settling in his chest as he adjusted his lens, snapping photos of their unraveling. He'd rattled them, cracked their armor with the chop shop hit, and now they were scrambling to hold the pieces together. their empire fracturing under the weight of his silent war. Inside Captain Holt's office, the air was thick with desperation. Isaiah couldn't hear their words through the glass, but their body language screamed panic, a tableau of collapse unfolding in real time. Kane's fists slammed the desk, his bruised face contorted with rage as he shouted, his voice carrying faintly through an open window, hoarse and breaking. "It's Carter Holt." He hit the chop shop, 3 Reapers down. "No damn trace. He's a ghost, and he's tearing us apart." Holt, a grizzled man with graying hair and a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face, leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he tried to maintain control over the spiraling mess, his eyes narrowing with frustration. "You've got no proof, Travis, just your hunch and a bunch of whining bikers with busted heads," he growled, his voice low and rough, cutting through Kane's tirade like a blade. "You're telling me one man took out 3 Reapers, walked off with a crate, and left nothing? You sound like you're losing your damn mind." Decker paced the cramped office, his hands trembling, his swollen lip quivering as he gestured wildly, his voice high and unsteady, cracking under the strain of his own fear. "He's not just one man, Captain. He's Delta Force, trained to kill, to vanish, to take out whole squads without breaking a sweat." "Kane's right. It's Carter. I know it. He's out there, watching us, waiting. He said no to our deal, and now he's hitting back." Holt rubbed his temples, his patience fraying under the weight of their collapse, his fists clenching on the desk as he leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Then find him," he barked, his tone sharp, commanding, a last grasp at control over the chaos threatening to engulf them. "Shut this down before it ends you both. The Reapers are calling me every hour, the mayor's asking questions. I'm not going down for your mess. You've got one job, stop him, or you're on your own." Isaiah lowered his lens, his smirk widening into a predator's grin, as he slipped the camera back into his duffel, the photos a growing archive of their fear. They were turning on each other, their confidence crumbling, their empire fracturing under the pressure he'd applied with every silent strike, chop shop down, Reapers bleeding, and now the cops sweating in their own precinct. He pulled up the footage from last night on his burner phone. Bikers scrambling as their guards fell, panic setting in, their rough voices shouting into the night, and a faint, cold satisfaction settled over him. The message had landed, and the heat was rising. He drove back to the motel, the town waking around him, cars rolling slow through the streets, whispers spreading in gas stations and diners, the air thick with unease. The room's stale air greeted him as he dumped his duffel on the bed, syncing the chop shop footage to his laptop, the glow illuminating his scarred face as he watched it loop, bikers falling, blood pooling, silence swallowing their shouts. Lena's folder sat open beside him, its pages a map of their corruption, Kane and Decker's sins laid bare, the Reapers' hangouts marked in red ink. He traced a line to the warehouse on Route 17, their main hub, their lifeline, his next target. The chop shop was just the beginning, a spark to ignite their fear. The warehouse would be the blaze to consume them. Lena arrived that evening, her sedan crunching gravel outside the motel, as she stepped into the room, her sharp features tight with urgency, her leather jacket slung over her shoulder. She dropped a new folder on the bed, its pages spilling slightly as she crossed her arms, her voice low and sharp. "You're making waves, Isaiah. Reapers are spooked, 3 down at the chop shop. No one saw a damn thing. Kane and Decker are losing it. Heard them yelling at Holt through a source. They know it's you." Isaiah flipped through the new pages, maps, schedules, a grainy photo of Kane meeting a cartel runner south of town. "Good," he said, his tone steady, his eyes scanning the details with a soldier's precision. "Let them sweat. What's this?" "Cartel hookup," Lena replied, stepping closer, her finger tapping the photo. "South of town, trailer park off Highway 9. Reaper's meth supply. Kane oversees the drops. Warehouse on Route 17's their main stash. Guns, drugs, cash. Hit either one, and they're crippled." Isaiah nodded, his jaw tightening as the plan solidified, his voice low. "Warehouse first, cut their heart out, then the cartel. They're bleeding already, time to make it fatal." Lena's eyes narrowed, her voice softening but firm. "Watch yourself, big brother. They're desperate. Desperate men get sloppy, but they also get mean. They started this," Isaiah said, his tone final, his eyes meeting hers with a fire that hadn't dimmed since the night his house burned. "I'm finishing it." She nodded, a faint smirk tugging at her lips as she stepped back. "I'll keep digging. Get you more by tomorrow. Stay sharp." She left, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving Isaiah alone with his gear and his rage. The cops felt the heat now, and he'd turn it into an inferno. The night cloaked Crestwood in a heavy stillness, the air thick with the promise of frost, as Isaiah Carter stood in the shadows of the town's east side, his eyes fixed on the trailer park a block away. It was 6 days since his house burned, and the reapers were reeling from the chop shop hit, 3 men down, their arrogance cracked by a ghost they couldn't name. Now it was time for the cops to bleed. His ribs still ached from Decker's baton, a dull throb pulsing with every breath, but it was a faint echo compared to the inferno of rage blazing in his chest, a fire stoked by the memory of flames swallowing his home, fueled by Kane and Decker's sneers as they'd watched it burn. His target tonight was Officer Ryan Decker, the younger, twitchier half of Crestwood's corrupt duo, a wiry man who hid his cowardice behind a badge and a sneer, a puppet dancing on Kane's strings. Decker lived in a rundown trailer on the edge of town, a squat aluminum box surrounded by overgrown weeds, rusted car parts, and the stench of neglect, a fitting lair for a man who thought power came from brutality. Isaiah had scouted it earlier, blending into the sparse traffic in his truck, his sharp eyes noting every detail. Decker's cruiser parked out front, no cameras, no neighbors close enough to hear a scream. The cop drank alone most nights, drowning his nerves in cheap beer and cigarettes, his arrogance leaving him exposed like a deer in a hunter's sights. Perfect. At 1 a.m., Isaiah slipped from his truck, parked a block away in a shadowed alley, his dark hoodie pulled low over his face, his boots crunching softly on the gravel as he moved through the night. In his hand he carried a collapsible baton and a tactical knife, tools of precision from his Delta Force days, weapons he'd wielded in deserts and jungles against enemies far deadlier than a small-town cop. The air was cool, thick with the scent of damp earth and gasoline. The cicadas hum a steady drone that masked his approach. He moved like a phantom, his steps silent, his breathing controlled, every sense honed to the night around him. Years of training snapping into place like a loaded clip. Decker sat outside on a folding chair, a cigarette glowing between his fingers, a half-empty beer bottle dangling from his other hand, its amber liquid catching the faint flicker of the trailer's porch light. The light buzzed erratically, casting jagged shadows across his pale, unshaven face, his eyes sunken and twitchy from too many sleepless nights. He muttered to himself, his voice slurring through the haze of alcohol, a disjointed rant spilling into the stillness. Damn Kane, pushing too hard, reapers screwing up, should have just paid the bastard off. His hands shook slightly, the cigarette trembling as he brought it to his lips, ash falling to the dirt in a soft gray scatter. A man fraying under pressure he couldn't control, a man who'd laughed as Isaiah's life burned. Isaiah paused behind a rusted pickup truck 10 yards from the trailer, his eyes narrowing as he studied his prey through the shadows, his breath steady, his pulse calm. Decker's hands shook, his cigarette dropping ash, his bottle wobbling as he took a swig. A man on edge, unraveling under the weight of his own sins. Isaiah's lips twitched into a faint, cold smile, a predator's grin. He'd make him understand, make him feel the fear he'd sown the night he'd swung that baton into Isaiah's ribs, the night he'd stood beside Kane and watched the flames rise. The first strike came fast, a baton to the back of Decker's skull, a sharp crack that split the night like a thunderclap, sending the cigarette flying and the bottle shattering on the ground in a spray of glass and foam. Decker grunted, toppling forward from the chair, his arms flailing as he hit the dirt face first, a muffled curse escaping his lips. What the? Isaiah didn't let him fall far. He grabbed the cop by the collar, yanking him up with one fluid motion and pinning him against the trailer's dented aluminum wall, the baton pressing hard against Decker's throat, its cold metal digging into his windpipe. Decker's eyes widened, panic flooding his pale face as he clawed at Isaiah's arm, his breath reeking of beer and stale smoke, his voice a choked, desperate gasp. Who the hell? Decker stammered, his words cut off as Isaiah tightened the baton, his grip unrelenting, his strength a wall no amount of thrashing could breach. Years of combat honed into a force that crushed Decker's resistance like dry twigs. You burned my house, Isaiah growled, his voice low and lethal, a storm rumbling in every syllable. His face inches from Decker's, his dark eyes burning with a fury that had simmered since the night his life turned to ash. You and Cain stood there laughing, while it went up in flames. You swung that baton. Decker cracked my ribs while my home died. You thought I'd break, thought I'd run. You remember that? Decker's mouth opened, a ragged wheeze escaping as he struggled for air, his hands flailing uselessly against Isaiah's iron grip, his nails scraping the fabric of the hoodie in a futile bid for escape. I didn't, I was just following Cain, he said, his voice cracked, high and desperate, a plea trembling on his lips as tears welled in his eyes, his bravado shattering under the weight of Isaiah's rage, his body trembling like a leaf in a storm. You did, Isaiah snapped, his tone a blade slicing through the lie, his baton pressing harder until Decker's face flushed red, veins bulging at his temples, his gasps turning to choked whimpers. You swung that baton into my ribs while my house burned. You laughed while I lost everything, my home, my peace, my life. You thought I'd break, thought your badge made you untouchable. You thought wrong. Decker thrashed, his boots scraping the dirt, his eyes bulging with terror, as he tried to twist free, his fingers clawing at Isaiah's arm in a desperate scramble, his voice breaking into a whimper. Please, please man, I didn't mean. Cain made me. I didn't want. His plea dissolved into a sob, tears streaking his pale face, his body shaking under Isaiah's unyielding hold. But Isaiah's expression didn't soften, didn't waver. He wasn't here for mercy, wasn't here for excuses. He was here for justice. And justice wore no mask of forgiveness. He released the baton just enough for Decker to suck in a ragged, gasping breath, the cop's chest heaving as he fought to speak, his body trembling under Isaiah's grip, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored the flames of that night. Then Isaiah drove a fist into his gut, a hard, precise strike that punched the air from Decker's lungs, doubling him over with a groan that echoed through the night, his hands clutching his stomach as he wheezed. Before the cop could recover, Isaiah followed with a knee to the jaw, a clean, brutal blow that snapped Decker's head back, blood spraying from his split lip in a crimson arc that glistened under the flickering porch light, splattering across the trailer's dented wall in a violent smear. Decker crumpled to the dirt, his hands scrabbling at the ground, his gasps turning to whimpers as he curled into a ball, his body shaking, his badge glinting uselessly in the faint glow, a tarnished symbol of power reduced to nothing. Isaiah towered over him, his breathing steady, his rage a cold, focused blade that cut through the haze of the night, his silhouette a dark sentinel against the trailer's flickering light. He crouched, grabbing Decker by the hair, and yanking his head up, forcing the cop to meet his gaze, his dark eyes locking onto Decker's swollen, tear-streaked ones, with an intensity that burned hotter than the fire that had taken his home. You're gonna wish you'd never set foot on my land, he said, his voice a quiet promise, each word weighted with intent, a vow etched in the blood pooling beneath Decker's face. You're gonna wish you'd never heard my name. Decker's eyes, wild and glassy, darted across Isaiah's face, recognition sinking in like a stone through water, dragging his defiance down with it, his voice a broken whisper as he coughed, choking on his own fear and blood. Carter, he rasped, blood bubbling at his lips, his body trembling as he tried to form words, his hands clawing weakly at the dirt. You're crazy. You can't do this. You don't know who you're messing with. Isaiah's grip tightened, his knuckles whitening as he pulled Decker closer, the knife flashing to the cop's throat, its edge glinting in the dim light, a hair's breadth from slicing deeper, drawing a thin bead of blood that trickled down Decker's neck. crazy, he said, his tone low, steady, a storm held in check by years of discipline. No, I'm just getting started. You and Kane, you're not untouchable anymore. You're prey, Decker, and I'm the hunter you didn't see coming. Decker whimpered, his body trembling, his hands clawing weakly at Isaiah's arm, his nails leaving faint scratches that drew no blood, no resistance, his voice a desperate plea fading into the night. Kane, he'll kill you. Please. I didn't. Tell Kane he's next, Isaiah said, releasing Decker's hair with a shove that sent the cop's head thudding back into the dirt, his body sprawling like a broken doll, a pitiful heap in the flickering light. He stood, his shadow falling over Decker like a death sentence, his knife sliding back into its sheath with a soft click, the baton collapsing into his pocket with a faint snap. Tell him, I'm coming for everything, your badges, your freedom, your lives. Tell him to sleep with one eye open, because I don't stop, not until you're both ash, just like my home. Decker groaned, blood pooling beneath his face, his body shaking as he tried to crawl away, his fingers digging into the dirt in a futile scramble, his whimpers fading into the night, like the last gasps of a dying man. You're dead, he rasped, his voice barely audible, a last gasp of defiance that sounded more like a plea, a broken man, clinging to the illusion of power. You don't know, you don't. I know exactly who you are. Isaiah cut in, his tone cold final, his eyes fixed on the broken cop as he stepped back, his silhouette merging with the darkness of the trailer park. And I'm the reckoning you didn't see coming. He turned, slipping back into the night, his steps silent as he melted into the shadows, leaving Decker crumpled in the dirt, a bloody testament to his wrath. The cicadas resumed their hum, the wind rustling the weeds, the flickering porch light casting a pitiful glow over the scene. A man shattered, a badge tarnished, a message delivered in blood and silence. Isaiah didn't look back. He didn't need to. The message would reach Kane by morning. Decker would crawl back, bruised and babbling, and the panic would spread like wildfire through their rotting empire. Back at the motel, Isaiah cleaned his knife in the bathroom sink, watching the blood rinse off in thin red streams that swirled down the drain, the water running clear as he scrubbed the blade with a steady hand, his reflection in the cracked mirror, a shadowed figure of resolve. He pulled up the footage from the chop shop hit on his burner phone. Bikers scrambling as their guards fell, panic setting in, their rough voices shouting into the night, and a faint cold smile tugged at his lips, a predator's satisfaction settling over him like a second skin. The Reapers were rattled, Decker was broken, and Kane would feel the heat next. They'd thought they could burn his life to ash and walk away unscathed. Thought their badges and their biker muscle made them gods. They didn't know they'd woken a hunter, a Delta Force veteran, who'd tear their empire apart brick by burning brick. He sat on the edge of the motel bed, the room's stale air heavy around him, and pulled Lena's folder from his duffel, spreading the pages across the worn mattress like a battlefield map. Complaints, reports, a trail of corruption stretching back years. Kane and Decker weren't just rogue cops. They were a cancer feeding off Crestwood's fear, propped up by the Reaper's muscle and the cartel's cash. His finger traced a line to the warehouse on Route 17, their main hub, their lifeline, his next target. The chop shop was a spark. The trailer hit a flare. The warehouse would be the blaze to consume them. He leaned back, his eyes drifting to the knife on the table, its edge gleaming faintly in the dim light, a silent witness to the blood it had drawn. Second strike, he muttered, his voice a low rumble in the empty room, a vow to the ashes of his past. You're next, Kane. The night hung heavy over Crestwood, a shroud of clouds blotting out the stars as Isaiah Carter crouched on a hill, overlooking the Iron Reaper's warehouse off Route 17. It was 7 days since his house burned to ash at the hands of Officer Travis Kane, Officer Ryan Decker and their biker enforcers, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and gasoline, a fitting prelude to the chaos he was about to unleash. The warehouse loomed below, a rusted sprawl of steel and concrete hiding a fortune in methamphetamine and illegal firearms, its flickering floodlights casting long shadows across the gravel lot. It was their main hub, the pulsing heart of their drug pipeline, guarded by 10 reapers and overseen by Cain himself, a king on a crooked throne, bruised but still defiant. Isaiah meant to rip that heart out and watch their empire bleed. He adjusted his night vision goggles, the world shifting into shades of green, as he scanned the scene below, his sharp eyes picking out every detail. 2 reapers at the entrance smoking cigarettes, 3 patrolling the perimeter with shotguns slung over their shoulders, 5 more inside, unloading a truck stacked with crates. Cain's cruiser sat parked 50 yards from the warehouse, the cop leaning against it, a cigarette glowing between his fingers, his bruised face tight with tension as he barked orders into a radio, his voice hoarse but sharp. "Hurry it up, damn it," he snapped, his eyes darting to the shadows, his free hand resting on his holstered gun. "Carter's out there. I can feel that bastard watching us." Isaiah's duffel bag rested beside him on the hill, packed with tools from his Delta Force days, Molotov cocktails crafted from glass bottles and rags soaked in gasoline, micro cameras for evidence, his suppressed Glock 19 nestled in its holster, and a few ounces of C4 he'd salvaged from the ashes of his old porch, a relic of a past life now repurposed for war. He wasn't here to negotiate or send warnings. He was here to dismantle, to burn their lifeline to the ground, and leave them scrambling in the wreckage. Cain Decker and the Reapers had thought they'd crushed him when they torched his home, thought they'd silenced him with fire and fear, thought their badges and their biker muscle made them invincible. Tonight they'd learn the cost of that arrogance, learn that Isaiah Carter didn't break. He burned brighter, hotter until his enemies were ash. He started with the cameras, slipping down the hill like a shadow, his boots silent on the damp grass as he moved through the underbrush, the pine needles soft underfoot. He planted 3 micro-devices around the warehouse perimeter, one on a rusted fence post facing the entrance, its lens hidden among the peeling paint, another in a pine tree, overlooking the truck at the loading dock, its branches masking the tiny device, a third near Cain's cruiser, tucked beneath a discarded tire, where it could catch the cop's every move. Each camera streamed live to his burner phone, their feeds flickering on the small screen as he tested them. Grainy green images of bikers unloading crates, Cain pacing, the night alive with their careless chatter, their voices rough with bravado and exhaustion. Evidence first, chaos second. He'd learned in Delta Force that wars weren't won with fists alone. They were won with proof, with leverage, with the kind of blow that left no room for recovery. The footage would bury them, but the fire would break them first. At 11:30, he lit the first Molotov, the rag flaring orange as he hurled it through a broken window on the warehouse's east side, his arm a practiced arc honed by years of throwing grenades in combat zones, precise, deadly, unerring. The glass shattered with a sharp crack, the bottle exploding inside, flames roaring to life as they licked up the walls and ignited a stack of crates near the door. Methamphetamine bursting into sparks, the chemicals fueling a blaze that spread faster than the bikers could react, a wildfire of destruction consuming the dry timber and cardboard. Shouts erupted from within, a cacophony of panic cutting through the night, curses in rough voices, boots stomping on concrete, the fire crackling as it leaped from crate to crate, the air thick with the acrid tang of burning chemicals. Isaiah moved, a shadow in the chaos, his goggles guiding him through the haze as he descended the hill, his knife flashing in his hand, his baton tucked into his belt. He took the door guards first, 2 reapers, hulking figures in leather vests emblazoned with the skull and snake emblem, coughing as they stumbled toward the blaze, their eyes watering from the smoke, their cigarettes falling forgotten to the gravel. A knife slashed across the first's throat, a silent kill that dropped him in a heap, blood pooling dark against the ground, his gurgling gasp swallowed by the roar of the fire, his body slumping into the shadows. The second swung a shotgun, his movements sluggish, his vision blurred by the smoke, but Isaiah sidestepped with the grace of a dancer, driving his baton into the man's skull with a dull thud that echoed over the flames. The biker crumpled, unconscious before he hit the gravel, his weapon clattering beside him, and Isaiah dragged both bodies into the underbrush, their vests snagging on the thorns. Inside, the warehouse was a war zone, flames leaping from crate to crate, their contents exploding in showers of sparks that lit the air with a deadly glow. Bikers scrambling to salvage what they could amid the choking smoke, their shouts swallowed by the roar of the blaze. Isaiah navigated the haze, his movements fluid, precise, a predator in his element, years of storming enemy compounds snapping into place, his body a machine of muscle and memory, his senses sharp despite the heat searing his skin. He spotted Cain near the back, shouting into a radio, his gun drawn, his face twisted with rage and fear, as he tried to rally his men, his bruised jaw trembling, his eyes darting wildly through the smoke. "Find him," Cain roared, his voice hoarse over the crackling fire, his cigarette falling to the concrete, as he waved his weapon, his free hand clutching the radio like a lifeline. "He's here. I know it's that bastard Carter. Get him, now, shoot anything that moves." Isaiah emerged from the smoke like a specter, his knife flashing as he closed the distance in 3 swift strides, his boots silent on the debris-strewn floor. Cain fired, a wild shot that ricocheted off a metal beam with a sharp ping, the bullet whizzing past Isaiah's ear, grazing his shoulder with a sting he barely felt. He dodged worse in tighter spots, taken shrapnel in places where hesitation meant death. He twisted Cain's wrist with a practiced snap, disarming him in a heartbeat, the gun clattering to the concrete, as Cain grunted in pain, his cigarette extinguished in a puddle of spilled fuel. Isaiah grabbed him by the throat, slamming him against a crate with a force that splintered the wood, the impact reverberating through the warehouse as Cain's breath was knocked out in a ragged wheeze, his radio slipping from his hand to crack against the floor. "You like fire?" Isaiah growled, his face inches from Cain's, his dark eyes burning with a rage that matched the blaze consuming the warehouse, his voice a low, lethal storm breaking over the chaos, his grip tightening until Cain's face flushed red. "You torched my home." Cain watched it burn, laughed while I lost everything I built with my own hands. "How's it feel now, huh? How's it feel to watch your world go up in flames?" Cain spat blood, his smirk gone, his voice ragged with defiance and fear, as he clawed at Isaiah's arm, his nails scraping uselessly against the hoodie's thick fabric, his eyes wide with a terror that hadn't been there the night he'd burned Isaiah's house. "You're dead, Carter," he rasped, his breath hitching, his bruised face twisting with a mix of pain and fury, as he struggled under Isaiah's hold. "You hear me? Dead. You can't stop us. We own this town, and you're nothing, a nobody who should have stayed down." Isaiah tightened his grip, his fingers digging into Cain's throat until the cop's veins bulged, his gasps turning to choked whimpers, his body trembling as the fire roared around them, the heat pressing in like a living thing. His knife flashed to Cain's jugular, its edge glinting in the firelight, drawing a thin line of blood that trickled down the cop's neck, a crimson thread against his pale skin, glistening in the orange glow. "You don't own anything anymore," Isaiah said, his tone a quiet promise, each word weighted with intent, a vow forged in the ashes of his home. "Not after tonight. Your reapers, your drugs, your power, it's all ash now, just like my house." A biker lunged from the smoke, a chain swinging in his scarred hands, his face twisted with fury as he charged through the haze, his leather vest glinting with the Reaper's emblem. "Get off him," he roared, his voice rough over the fire's roar, the chain whistling through the air as he swung at Isaiah's head. Isaiah released Cain with a shove, rolling to the side, as the chain clinked against the crate with a sharp clang, the metal sparking where it struck. He drove his elbow into the biker's jaw with a crack that echoed over the flames, the man's head snapping back as blood sprayed from his mouth, his teeth clattering to the floor. Isaiah followed with a knee to the gut, doubling the biker over with a groan, then a baton strike to the temple, a swift brutal blow that dropped him in a heap, his body crumpling into the burning debris, blood pooling beneath his still form, his chain falling uselessly beside him. Cain scrambled up, coughing violently, his eyes wild with terror as he backed away through the smoke, his hands fumbling for the radio he'd dropped, his boots slipping on the debris-strewn floor as he shouted into the haze, "Carter, you're a dead man." His voice broke, his bravado fraying as the warehouse burned around him, the flames leaping higher, the roof groaning under the strain, timbers snapping like bones. Isaiah was on him again, pinning him against another crate, the knife returning to his throat with a steady hand, its edge pressing just hard enough to draw another bead of blood, the cop's breath hitching as he trembled under the blade. "You burned my life," Isaiah said, his voice steady, his rage a cold, focused blade cutting through the chaos, his eyes locked onto Kane's panicked ones, with an intensity that burned hotter than the fire around them. "You stood there with Decker, laughing as it went up in smoke, my home, my peace, everything I built. Now I'm burning yours, your warehouse, your reapers, your whole damn empire. Run, Kane. Tell Decker it's over. Tell him I'm coming for him next." Kane's eyes darted, fear breaking through his defiance, his breath hitching as the warehouse collapsed around them, bikers fleeing through the smoke, crates exploding in bursts of flame, the fire roaring like a beast unleashed, the air thick with ash, and the stench of burning chemicals. "You can't win," he rasped, his voice trembling, his body shaking under Isaiah's grip, as the heat pressed in, sweat mixing with the blood on his face, his bruised jaw quivering. "You're one man, one damn man. You can't take us all. One man's enough." Isaiah cut in, his tone final, his knife steady, as he shoved Kane hard into the crate, the wood splintering further under the impact, the cop's body slamming against it with a groan. He drove a fist into Kane's jaw, a sharp crack as the cop's head snapped back, blood streaming from his nose and mouth, his body slumping against the crate in a daze, his radio falling uselessly to the floor, its static drowned by the fire's roar. "Run," Isaiah repeated, stepping back, his silhouette framed by the flames, his goggles glinting in the firelight like the eyes of a predator, his voice a low command cutting through the chaos. "While you still can." Kane staggered to his feet, coughing violently, his face a mask of blood and terror as he stumbled toward the exit, his boots slipping on the debris-strewn floor, his hands clutching his throat as he gasped for air, the fire roaring behind him like a judgment. Isaiah slipped back into the smoke, his chest heaving, his hands steady as he navigated the haze, his goggles guiding him through the chaos. As bikers fled, their shouts swallowed by the inferno, the warehouse collapsing in a symphony of destruction, timbers snapping, steel groaning, flames leaping into the night sky. He reached the hill, pulling up the footage on his burner phone. Kane's panicked shouts, the fight in the smoke, the warehouse burning, all captured in vivid green and black. The cameras had it all, a noose tightening around their necks, a blow they couldn't recover from. Back at the motel, Isaiah synced the footage to his laptop, the glow illuminating his scarred face as he watched the warehouse burn on screen, the reapers scattering, Kane's terror etched in every frame, his flight through the smoke a testament to his breaking. He cleaned the shallow graze on his shoulder from Kane's wild shot, the sting a minor price for the chaos he'd sown, bandaging it with a strip of cloth torn from an old shirt, his hands steady as he worked, the blood rinsing off in the sink alongside the soot and sweat. The warehouse gambit had worked, chaos was his ally now, and he'd wield it like a blade to cut deeper. The reapers were broken, Kane was shattered, and Decker would feel the heat next. Isaiah leaned back, his eyes drifting to the knife on the table, its edge gleaming faintly in the dim light, a silent witness to the blood it had drawn, a tool of the hunter he'd become. "Second strike," he muttered, his voice a low rumble in the empty room, a vow to the ashes of his past that still lingered in his mind. His home, his peace, his life, all fuel for the fire he'd turn against them. "You're next, Decker." He pulled Lena's folder closer, flipping through the pages, his finger tracing a line to the cartel drop south of town. Highway 9, a trailer park, their meth lifeline. The warehouse was burning, the chop shop was crippled, and Decker was bleeding. One more cut, and their empire would bleed out. He cleaned his knife again, the blade gleaming as he worked, his hands steady, his mind sharp. A hunter awakened, a storm rising, a reckoning unstoppable. The morning sun rose gray and heavy over Crestwood, casting a pallid light on a town waking to the chaos Isaiah Carter had unleashed. It was 7 days since his house burned at the hands of Officer Travis Kane, Officer Ryan Decker, and their Iron Reaper enforcers, and the footage he'd captured, chop shop takedown, Decker's beating at the trailer, the warehouse inferno, was spreading through Crestwood like wildfire, through dry brush, a blaze of outrage igniting the quiet streets. By 8 a.m., the town was ablaze with anger. Hashtags like #Crestwood, corruption and #justice, for Carter trending on social media, phones buzzing with fury, news vans rolling into town like vultures circling a fresh kill, their cameras trained on the precinct, where the heart of the corruption pulsed. Isaiah sat in a diner across from the station, a coffee mug untouched in his hand, his burner phone streaming the fallout, as the town's underbelly writhed under the pressure he'd applied. The diner's TV blared above the counter, a local anchor stumbling through the breaking story, her voice tight with urgency as she clutched her notes, her eyes wide with the weight of the news. Shocking footage has emerged overnight, revealing alleged corruption within Crestwood PD, meth labs, assaults, a warehouse fire that's left residents demanding answers from authorities, she said, her tone faltering, as the screen cut to grainy clips, bikers unloading crates in the chop shop, Decker's bloodied face groaning in the trailer park dirt, the warehouse exploding in a fireball that lit the night sky. Isaiah's name flashed across the ticker, Isaiah Carter, local mechanic, victim of a house fire, tied to the chaos, though no one had proof he was the ghost behind it. Not yet. The anchor's voice tightened as she added, police have declined to comment, but sources say Internal Affairs is investigating. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, their numbers swelling with every passing minute, their signs hastily scrawled with demands. End corruption now. Justice for Carter. Cops out. Their voices rising in a chorus that rattled the diner's windows, a chant that echoed through the streets, angry, raw, unstoppable. Kane and Decker must go, a woman shouted, her voice cutting through the hum, her sign trembling in her hands. They burned his house, now he's burning them back. A man roared beside her, his phone raised filming the growing crowd. Isaiah's telephoto lens rested on the table, hidden beneath a folded newspaper, its focus trained on the precinct's entrance as the chaos unfolded before his eyes, a storm he'd ignited now raging beyond his control. At 8:15, Kane stormed into the precinct, his face a mess of bruises, jaw swollen from the warehouse hit, nose crusted with dried blood, his left arm cradled stiffly from the fight with Isaiah, his uniform wrinkled and stained with soot and sweat. Decker followed, limping from the trailer park beating, his swollen lip trembling, his eyes wild with paranoia, as he scanned the growing crowd, his hands twitching nervously at his sides, his badge glinting faintly under the precinct's harsh lights. The swagger they'd carried the night they burned Isaiah's house was gone, replaced by a brittle tension that radiated from every jerky movement, every furtive glance toward the protesters pressing against the station's doors. Isaiah smirked faintly, a cold satisfaction settling in his chest as he sipped his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him amidst the storm he'd unleashed. He'd cracked their armor with every strike, and now they were scrambling to hold the pieces together, their empire fracturing under the weight of his silent war. Inside Captain Holt's office, the air was thick with desperation. Isaiah couldn't hear their words through the glass, but their body language screamed panic, a tableau of collapse unfolding in real time, as he adjusted his lens, snapping photos of their unraveling. Kane's fists slammed the desk, his bruised face contorted with rage as he shouted, his voice carrying faintly through an open window, hoarse and breaking over the din of the crowd outside. It's Carter, Holt. He's hitting us everywhere. Chop shop, warehouse, Decker's trailer. He's a damn ghost, and he's tearing us apart. I told you he wouldn't break. Holt, a grizzled man with graying hair and a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face, leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he tried to maintain control over the spiraling mess, his eyes narrowing with a mix of frustration and disbelief as he stared at his two unraveling officers. "You've got no proof, Travis. Just your word and a bunch of whining bikers with busted heads," he growled, his voice low and rough, cutting through Kane's tirade like a blade through flesh. "You're telling me one man took out 3 Reapers at the chop shop, beat Decker to a pulp, torched your warehouse, and left nothing but smoke? You sound like you're losing your damn mind, both of you." Decker paced the cramped office, his hands trembling, his swollen lip quivering as he gestured wildly, his voice high and unsteady, cracking under the strain of his own fear, as he spun toward Holt, his eyes wide with panic. "He's not just one man, Captain. He's Delta Force, trained to kill, to vanish, to take out whole squads without breaking a sweat. He beat the hell out of me at my trailer, came out of nowhere, hit me like a damn truck, said Kane's next, said he's coming for our badges, our lives. He's not stopping. He's a machine, Holt, and he's out there right now, watching us." Holt rubbed his temples, his patience fraying under the weight of their collapse, his fists clenching on the desk as he leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the room like a whip. "Then find him," he barked, his tone sharp, commanding, a last grasp at control over the chaos, threatening to engulf them all. "Shut this down before it ends you both. I don't care how you do it, but do it fast. The Reapers are calling me every hour. The mayor's breathing down my neck. Iowa's sniffing around. I'm not going down for your damn mess. You've got one job. Stop him, or you're on your own, and I'll wash my hands of you." Isaiah lowered his lens, his smirk widening into a predator's grin, as he slipped the camera back into his duffel, the photos a growing archive of their fear, Kane's bruised rage, Decker's trembling panic, Holt's fraying control. They were turning on each other, their confidence crumbling, their empire fracturing under the pressure. The night stretched long and black over the back roads south of Crestwood, a heavy stillness broken only by the faint hum of Isaiah Carter's truck, as he rolled toward Highway 9, headlights off, the darkness his cloak. It was 8 days since his house burned at the hands of Officer Travis Kane, Officer Ryan Decker, and their Iron Reaper enforcers, and the town was teetering on the edge of chaos. Reapers reeling from the chop shop and warehouse hits, Kane and Decker fraying under the pressure of Isaiah's relentless strikes. Tonight he aimed to sever their lifeline, a cartel drop at a trailer park off the highway, the source of the Reapers' methamphetamine, guarded by 5 bikers and 2 cartel runners, with Kane overseeing the deal like a crooked overseer. Isaiah meant to cut that vein and watch them bleed out. He parked a quarter-mile out, blending into the shadows of a pine-lined road, the truck's engine ticking softly as it cooled. He slipped from the cab, his dark hoodie pulled low, his boots crunching faintly on the gravel as he moved through the woods toward the clearing, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Inside were tools from his Delta Force days, a few ounces of C4 salvaged from his burned home, micro cameras for evidence, his suppressed Glock 19, and a pair of Molotov cocktails, enough to destroy their supply and leave them scrambling. The air was sharp with frost, the faint tang of diesel drifting from the clearing, a prelude to the fire he'd ignite. The trailer park came into view through the trees, a battered double-wide parked in its center, surrounded by a loose circle of Harleys gleaming under the faint moonlight, their chrome glinting like predators' teeth. 5 Reapers lounged around it, 2 smoking near the bikes, their leather vests patched with the skull and snake emblem, 2 unloading crates from the trailer, their voices rough with exhaustion, 1 pacing with a shotgun slung over his shoulder, his eyes darting to the shadows. 2 cartel runners, wiry men in black jackets, stood by a pickup truck, counting stacks of cash under a lantern's glow, their Spanish chatter low and clipped. Kane's cruiser sat parked 50 yards away, the cop leaning against it, his gun drawn, his bruised face tight with tension as he barked into a radio, his voice hoarse with paranoia. "Hurry it up," he snapped, his eyes scanning the trees. "Carter's out there. I know he's watching. Move it." Isaiah adjusted his night vision goggles, the world shifting into shades of green as he scanned the scene, his sharp eyes picking out every detail, the Reaper's lazy sprawl, the cartel's quick hands, Kane's twitching grip on his gun. He moved silently, a predator in the dark, planting 3 micro-cameras around the clearing, one on a tree facing the trailer, its lens hidden among the needles, one near the bikes, tucked beneath a discarded helmet, one by Kane's cruiser concealed in a patch of weeds, each streaming live to his burner phone. Evidence first, destruction second. He'd learned in Delta Force that proof was the blade that cut deepest, and tonight he'd carve their empire apart. At 12:45, he rigged the C4 under the trailer's chassis, his fingers steady as he set the timer. 10 seconds, enough to clear the blast zone. His breath controlled as he worked, the faint tick of the device swallowed by the night. He lit a Molotov as a decoy, hurling it toward the bikes, the bottle shattering in a burst of flame that ignited the fuel tanks with a roar, the explosion sending a fireball into the sky, the Harleys erupting in a shower of sparks. The Reapers shouted, diving for cover as the fire spread, smoke billowing thick and black, the cartel runners bolting for their truck, their cash scattering in the wind. Isaiah hit the detonator, and the C4 erupted, a muffled boom that shook the ground, sending the trailer up in a fireball, meth crates exploding in a cascade of flames, and chemicals that lit the clearing like a war zone, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning drugs. Chaos reigned, Reapers scrambling, coughing, their silhouettes frantic against the orange glow, the cartel runners shouting in Spanish as they fled, their truck peeling out with a screech of tires. Isaiah struck, a shadow in the chaos, the shotgun biker first, a knife slashing across his throat, a silent kill that dropped him in a heap, blood pooling dark against the dirt, his weapon falling uselessly beside him. The 2 unloading crates turned, one swinging a crowbar, the other fumbling for a pistol, their eyes wide with panic. But Isaiah was faster. He sidestepped the crowbar, driving his baton into the man's skull with a dull thud that echoed over the flames, then pivoted, slamming his elbow into the second's jaw, followed by a knee to the gut that sent him sprawling, unconscious, his pistol skittering across the gravel. The remaining Reapers fired blindly into the smoke, their shots wild, ricocheting off trees as Isaiah slipped through the haze, his goggles guiding him, his knife flashing in his hand. He took down one near the bikes. A quick slash to the thigh dropped him screaming, a baton strike to the temple silencing him, his body crumpling into the burning wreckage. The last biker charged, a chain swinging, but Isaiah ducked, driving his knife into the man's gut, twisting it with a practiced snap that drew a choked gasp, then a fist to the jaw that sent him down, blood pooling beneath him as he lay still. Kane stood near the cruiser, shouting into his radio, his gun trembling in his hand, his bruised face twisted with rage and terror as he scanned the burning clearing. "Where are you, you bastard?" he roared, his voice cracking, his eyes darting wildly through the smoke, his free hand clutching the radio like a lifeline. "Show yourself, Carter. I'll put you down myself." He fired into the haze, a desperate shot that punched through a tree trunk, the bark splintering as the bullet buried itself uselessly in the wood. Isaiah emerged behind him, a specter in the chaos, his knife flashing as he closed the distance in 3 swift strides. Kane spun, firing again, the bullet grazing Isaiah's shoulder with a sharp sting he ignored. He'd felt worse in combat, taken shrapnel in tighter spots. He twisted Kane's wrist with a snap, disarming him, the gun clattering to the gravel, as Kane grunted in pain, his radio slipping from his hand to crack against the ground. Isaiah grabbed him by the throat, slamming him against the cruiser's hood, the metal denting under the impact. Kane's breath knocked out in a ragged wheeze as he clawed at Isaiah's arm, his nails scraping uselessly against the hoodie. "You're bleeding out," Isaiah growled, his face inches from Kane's, his dark eyes burning with a rage that matched the fire consuming the trailer, his voice a low lethal storm, cutting through the chaos. "Your bikers, your cartel, your drugs, all gone. You burned my house, Kane. Thought you'd break me. Now your empire's ash." Kane spat blood, his voice ragged, his defiance fraying as he struggled under Isaiah's grip, his eyes wide with terror. "You're nothing, Carter. You can't stop us. We own this town. You're one man." Isaiah tightened his grip, pinning Kane's throat against the hood, his knife flashing to the cop's jugular, drawing a thin line of blood that glistened in the firelight, trickling down Kane's neck in a crimson thread. "One man's enough," he said, his tone a quiet promise. His eyes locked onto Kane's panicked ones. "Run, Kane. Tell Decker it's over." He released Kane with a shove, driving a fist into his jaw, a sharp crack as the cop's head snapped back, blood streaming from his nose, his body slumping against the cruiser. Isaiah slipped back into the shadows, the clearing a smoldering wreck, the footage captured, a noose tightening. The sun rose over Crestwood, a reluctant witness to a town erupting in chaos. 9 days after Isaiah Carter's house burned, the footage chop shop trailer, warehouse cartel drop, hit the internet at dawn, seeded by Lena's contacts to news sites, activist groups and social media, each clip tagged with Kane and Decker's names, a raw indictment of their corruption. By 8, hashtags like SAG Crestwood corruption and justice for Carter trended, phones buzzed with outrage, news vans swarmed the precinct, their cameras trained on a town teetering on the edge. Isaiah sat in a diner across the street, a coffee mug untouched, his burner phone streaming the fallout. The TV blared, Crestwood PD under fire, shocking footage links officers to drugs, violence. Protesters swelled outside chanting justice for Carter, their signs "End corruption now," rattling the window. Kane stormed in, bruised and wild-eyed, Decker limping behind, their swagger gone, replaced by panic. Inside Holt's office, Kane shouted, "It's Carter, he's everywhere." Decker whimpered, "He's Delta Force. He won't stop." Holt barked, "Find him, or you're done." Isaiah smirked, the footage, Kane's panic, Decker's blood, his noose. The town was awake, their empire cracking, and he'd fan the flames until it burned. The night draped Crestwood in a heavy shroud, the air thick with tension as the clock ticked past 2 a.m. 9 days since Isaiah Carter's house burned at the hands of Officer Travis Kane, Officer Ryan Decker, and their Iron Reaper enforcers. The town was a powder keg, protests swelling, footage of corruption spreading like wildfire, the Reapers scattering, and Kane and Decker teetering on the edge of collapse. Isaiah sat in his motel room, the stale air heavy around him, his burner phone glowing on the table with the latest news feeds, his laptop syncing footage from the chop shop, trailer, warehouse and cartel hits. He'd expected retaliation. Men like Kane and Decker didn't go down quietly, not when their empire was crumbling under the weight of his strikes. Tonight he was ready, a hunter waiting for prey to stumble into his trap. The door exploded inward with a splintering crash, the cheap wood buckling under a heavy boot as Kane and Decker stormed in. Guns drawn, their faces twisted with a desperate feral rage. "You're done, Carter," Kane roared, his voice hoarse and breaking, his bruised jaw trembling as he fired a wild shot, the bullet punching through the wall above Isaiah's head, plaster dust raining down in a faint cloud. Decker followed, his swollen lip quivering, his eyes wild with panic as he swung his baton, his limp from the trailer beating slowing his charge. "You think you can ruin us? You're nothing," he shouted, his voice high and unsteady, cracking under the strain of his own fear. Isaiah had anticipated this. His duffel bag lay open on the bed, his Glock within reach, but he didn't draw it yet. Micro cameras hummed in the corners, 3 tiny lenses hidden in the smoke detector, the lamp base and a crack in the wall, streaming live to his laptop, capturing every move, every word. He'd rigged the room hours ago, a trap set with the precision of his Delta Force training, knowing desperate men like these would lash out when cornered. He dove behind the bed as Kane fired again, the bullet thudding into the mattress, feathers bursting into the air, the report echoing through the cramped space. "Get up, you bastard!" Kane snarled, advancing, his gun trembling in his grip, his bruised face a mask of fury and terror. Isaiah rolled, springing to his feet in a fluid motion, his knife flashing as he closed the distance. Decker swung his baton, aiming for Isaiah's skull, but Isaiah sidestepped, twisting Decker's wrist with a snap that sent the weapon clattering to the floor. The cop's yelp sharp and high as he clutched his arm, his swollen lip splitting further with blood. Kane lunged, his gun raised, but Isaiah was faster. He drove his elbow into Kane's jaw, a crack echoing as the cop's head snapped back, blood spraying from his nose, his gun slipping from his grasp to skitter across the linoleum. "You're too late," Isaiah growled, his voice low, lethal, his dark eyes burning with a rage that had simmered since the night his home turned to ash. Kane staggered, coughing blood, his hands clawing at Isaiah's hoodie, his voice ragged with defiance and fear. "You're dead, Carter. You hear me? Dead. We'll bury you." He swung a wild fist, his bruised knuckles glancing off Isaiah's shoulder, but Isaiah took the hit, his body absorbing the blow like a wall, his training kicking in, years of combat, hardening him against worse than this. He grabbed Kane's throat, slamming him against the wall, the plaster cracking under the impact. Kane's breath knocked out in a ragged wheeze as he struggled, his eyes wide with panic. Decker scrambled for his baton, his limp slowing him, his hands trembling as he shouted, "Get off him!" He swung again, the weapon whistling through the air, but Isaiah released Kane with a shove, ducking under the blow, driving his knee into Decker's gut with a thud that doubled the cop over. His wheeze sharp and pained, Isaiah followed with a fist to Decker's jaw, a clean, brutal strike that snapped his head back, blood spraying from his split lip, his body crumpling to the floor in a heap, his baton rolling away, his whimpers fading into the night. Kane roared, lunging again, his fists swinging wildly, his bruised face contorted with a rage that bordered on madness. "You can't win. You're nothing," he shouted, his voice breaking, his hands clawing at Isaiah's face, but Isaiah caught his wrist, twisting it with a snap that drew a scream. Kane's arm bending at an unnatural angle, his body buckling as he sank to his knees, blood dripping from his nose and mouth. Isaiah pinned him, his knee on Kane's chest, his knife flashing to the cop's throat, its edge glinting in the dim light, drawing a thin bead of blood that trickled down Kane's neck, a crimson thread against his pale skin. "You burned my house," Isaiah growled, his face inches from Kane's, his dark eyes locking onto the cop's panicked ones, his voice a low, lethal storm, cutting through the chaos. "You laughed while it went up in flames, thought you'd broken me. Now look at you, bleeding, begging. Your empire ash. You're done, Kane." Kane's eyes darted, fear breaking through his defiance, his breath hitching as he struggled under Isaiah's grip, his voice a ragged plea. "Please, Carter. We can deal. Just stop." His words dissolved into a cough, blood bubbling at his lips, his body trembling as the reality sank in, his empire crumbling around him. Isaiah didn't flinch, his knife steady, his rage a cold, focused blade. "No deals," he said, his tone final, his eyes burning with a fire that hadn't dimmed since the night his life turned to ash. "You started this. I'm finishing it." Decker groaned from the floor, crawling toward his gun, his swollen lip trembling, his voice a desperate whimper. "Kane, he's gonna kill us." He reached for the weapon, his fingers brushing the grip, but Isaiah kicked it away, the metal skittering across the linoleum, then drove his boot into Decker's ribs, a sharp crack as the cop gasped, curling into a ball, his whimpers fading into the chaos. Kane thrashed, his free hand clawing at Isaiah's leg, his voice a broken plea. "You can't, you don't know what you're doing. We'll bury you." Isaiah silenced him with a fist to the jaw, another crack echoing as Kane's head snapped back, his body slumping against the wall, blood streaming from his nose and mouth, his eyes fluttering as he teetered on the edge of consciousness. Isaiah stood, towering over them, his breathing steady, his rage a cold, controlled storm, as he stepped back, letting them writhe in their ruin. He'd taken their hits, fists bruising his ribs, boots grazing his legs, but he didn't fight back fully, not yet. The cameras had it all, the break-in, the shots, the assault, streaming live to his laptop, a noose tightening around their necks. "You're done," he said, his voice low, final, his dark eyes fixed on Kane's bloodied face. "Crawl back to Holt. Tell him it's over. Kane groaned, his body shaking as he tried to stand, his bruised arm hanging limp, his voice a ragged whisper. You're dead, Decker whimpered, curling tighter, his hands clutching his ribs, his badge glinting faintly in the dim light, a tarnished symbol of power reduced to nothing. Isaiah stepped back, his knife sheathed, his baton tucked away, his silhouette framed by the splintered door, as he slipped into the night. The motel's silence returned, broken only by Kane and Decker's ragged breaths, their empire fracturing under the weight of their own desperation. Back at the truck he checked the footage, Kane's wild shots, Decker's baton swings, their panicked threats, all captured, a final nail in their coffin. The counterattack had failed, and the trap had sprung. The morning sun broke over Crestwood, casting a harsh light on a town unraveling 10 days after Isaiah Carter's house burned. The motel footage hit the internet at dawn, seated by Lena's contacts. Kane and Decker storming in, guns blazing, their desperate assault captured in vivid detail, a raw testament to their collapse. By night, the precinct was a war zone. Protesters swelled into the hundreds, their chants, "Justice for Carter, end corruption now," shaking the streets, news vans clogging every corner, their cameras trained on the station as the crowd pressed against barricades, signs raised high. Kane and Decker out. Crestwood deserves justice. Isaiah sat in a holding cell, his wrists cuffed, his ribs bruised from Kane and Decker's fists, but his face was calm, his dark eyes steady as he leaned against the concrete wall. The precinct buzzed around him, officers shouting, phones ringing, the air thick with panic, but he'd expected this, planned for it. The footage was his blade, cutting deeper than any knife, and Lena was outside working the strings, her contacts amplifying the storm he'd unleashed. He'd taken their hits last night, let them cuff him, knowing the cameras had captured their downfall, a noose tightening with every frame. Outside, the diner's TV blared, the anchor's voice trembling as she reported live. New footage shows officers Travis Kane and Ryan Decker attacking a suspect in a motel room, escalating allegations of corruption within Crestwood PD. Protests are growing, with residents demanding their arrest. The screen cut to clips, Kane firing wild shots, Decker swinging his baton, Isaiah's calm defiance as they dragged him out, blood dripping from his lip, the crowd's roar as they filmed his exit. His name flashed again, Isaiah Carter, mechanic, victim, hero tied to a war no one could ignore. Inside Holt's office, the collapse unfolded. Kane and Decker faced their captain, their faces pale, their voices rising in a desperate cacophony. "It's Carter!" Kane shouted, slamming his bruised fists on the desk, his broken arm trembling, blood crusted on his jaw. "He set us up, those cameras. He's been playing us from the start." Decker paced, his swollen lip quivering, his hands shaking as he gestured wildly, his voice high and breaking. "He's Delta Force. He knew we'd come. He wanted this. We're done, Kane, done." Holt leaned back, his scowl deepening, his voice a growl as he glared at them. "You idiots. You walked into his trap. You've got no proof, just your damn mess. Is here, the mayor's calling for your heads and the town's ready to burn this place down. I told you to stop him, now you've handed him everything." Isaiah smirked from his cell, overhearing the chaos through the open door, his cuffs clinking as he shifted, the bruises on his ribs a dull ache he ignored. He'd taken worse in combat, endured more in silence. The precinct was fracturing, officers turning on each other, some defending Kane and Decker, others distancing themselves, their voices a tangle of panic and blame. At 3 p.m. Officer Martinez approached, his face grim, his keys jangling as he unlocked the cell. "You're out," he said, his voice low, his eyes avoiding Isaiah's. "They're done. Isaiah's taking them now." Isaiah stood, his wrists free, his posture steady as he stepped into the hall, the precinct's chaos swirling around him, officers shouting, phones ringing, the crowd's roar seeping through the walls. "They're done?" he asked, his voice low, steady, his dark eyes locking onto Martinez. Martinez nodded, his tone clipped. "Kane and Decker cuffed and gone. Reapers are scattering, half their guys bolted after the cartel hit. You broke them, Carter." Isaiah stepped outside, the sun harsh on his bruised face, the crowd erupting as they saw him, cheers, shouts, phones raised filming his exit. Kane and Decker were led out in cuffs, their heads bowed, their faces hollow, Kane's broken arm limp, Decker's swollen lip trembling, their badges stripped, their empire ash. The Reaper's remnants fled, their bikes roaring out of town, their reins shattered. Isaiah slipped through the crowd, the victory bitter but real, the weight of his rage lifting as the town reclaimed its voice. The trial came swift and brutal. 11 days after Isaiah's house burned, a courtroom packed with reporters, protesters, and Crestwood's weary residents, their eyes fixed on the reckoning unfolding before them. Isaiah sat in the witness stand, his wrists uncuffed, his bruised ribs aching under a clean shirt. Lena had brought, his dark eyes steady as he faced the gallery. Kane and Decker in orange jumpsuits, their faces pale, their defiance shattered. The Reaper's scarred leader, arrested after the cartel hit, slumped beside them, his leather vest replaced by chains. The footage, chop shop, trailer, warehouse, motel, played on a screen, each clip a hammer blow, Lena's files stacked high on the prosecution's table, a tombstone for their empire. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Elena Ruiz, paced before the jury, her voice clear and cutting as she laid out the case. Isaiah Carter lost everything, his home, his peace, because these men thought they could silence him with fire, she said, pointing at Kane and Decker, her fingers steady. They ran Crestwood like a fiefdom, with the Iron Reapers as their muscle, burning, beating, and extorting anyone who stood in their way. But Carter fought back, exposed them, broke them, and today you'll hold them accountable. Isaiah took the stand, his voice low, steady, recounting the night, Kane's smirk, Decker's baton, the Reaper's Molotovs, his words calm, but weighted with a rage that filled the room. They burned my house because I wouldn't bend, he said, his dark eyes sweeping the jury. I lost everything, my past, my peace, but I wouldn't let them win. They thought they owned this town. They were wrong. Kane glared, his broken arm trembling, his voice a ragged snarl as he interrupted. He's a liar, a vigilante. He attacked us. Decker whimpered. He set us up. But the footage silenced them. Kane firing in the motel, Decker swinging his baton, their corruption laid bare. The jury deliberated an hour, returning with a verdict. Guilty, arson, corruption, assault, conspiracy. 20 years each, no parole. The Reaper's leader got 30. The gavel fell, a sharp crack, and they were led away, their empire ash. Isaiah watched, stone-faced, as Kane's glare faded. Decker's whimpers echoed, the crowd erupting in cheers outside. A bitter victory, but a victory nonetheless. Crestwood changed in the weeks that followed, the protests fading, the precinct purged, the Reapers gone. 12 days after Isaiah's house burned, the town breathed free, its streets quiet but scarred. Isaiah stood in the ruins, the sun setting over the blackened skeleton of his home, his boots crunching ash as he sifted through the debris, his hands brushing the charred remnants of his past, melted tools, a cracked photo frame, a life lost to fire. The victory was real. Kane and Decker in prison, the Reapers scattered, but it was hollow, the weight of loss pressing heavy on his shoulders. Lena arrived, her sedan crunching gravel, her sharp features softening as she stepped beside him, her voice low. You did it, Isaiah. Broke them, freed this town. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the ruins, his voice steady but heavy. I did it for us, for Crestwood, but it doesn't bring it back. They stood in silence, the wind stirring ash, the town healing around them, new patrols, honest cops, residents reclaiming their streets. You'll rebuild, Lena said, her hand on his shoulder. You always do. He nodded again, the plan forming, a new house, a new start, a life forged from the ashes. Months later, Crestwood stood renewed. 13 days after the fire, a distant memory. Kane and Decker forgotten. The Reapers, a ghost story. The town free. Isaiah stood on his new porch, a beer in hand. The house rising from the ashes, wood fresh, walls sturdy, a sanctuary rebuilt. The night was quiet, the air cool, the stars bright above, and he breathed deep, the weight lifting, scars remaining but fading. Lena joined him, her smile faint, her voice soft. Looks good, big brother. He nodded, his dark eyes steady, his tone low. It's a start. The fight was over. He'd won, not just for himself, but for Crestwood, A new dawn breaking over a town reclaimed.